Well, my biggest problem when I started doing this research, and even back when I was still associated with college teaching, was that the Western academies and American universities in particular seem unable to look at the problems with the assumptions that they make concerning human prehistory. And the problem is briefly and basically this, that if you look at the rise of civilizations such as the Indus Valley civilization, the rise of Sumer in Mesopotamia, the rise of Egypt for that matter, what you're looking at are really civilizations that come fully formed when they arrive on the scene. In other words, there's no gradual period leading up to them. They're just all of a sudden there. And they're there with a great deal of mathematical sophistication, astronomical sophistication. They have organized economies. So in other words, the evolutionary model that was imposed on human prehistory just really didn't work. And you get sort of a sidestepping of this profound issue. So when you're looking at a time frame, and one thing I should point out is that in my books I do not really go the Sitchin-esque route of trying to construct a detailed timetable, and the reason why is that I think you have to reconstruct this history in broad outline first. In other words, get a basic chronological order of things that happen, but not necessarily trying to fix any particular date to them. Now, I do fix a date in the Cosmic War for what I think happened millennia ago, and that is basically that there was a cosmic war. It was fought right here in our own solar system. And if you look at the scientific and astronomical data that are associated with it, that would fix a date of approximately 3.2 million years ago. So, standard academic history says that there was really nothing going on back then as far as humanity is concerned. And in fact, as I point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, the genetic basis of the origins of humanity, most geneticists believe, begins between 150 and 200,000 years ago, which to me is a very, very significant figure, Frater X, because if you look at some of the ancient texts that I examine in the Cosmic War and in other books in that whole arch of books, they will tell you, for example, in the Sumerian Kings list, that the so-called Anunnaki, the gods, if you will, arrived here approximately 250,000 years ago. So that seems to square rather interestingly with the results of genetic research that place the origins of modern man circa 150 to 200,000 years ago. So I don't really fasten any broad chronological scheme on things other than those two dates, 3.2 million years ago for this cosmic war, and then the various kings lists from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and try and couple those with modern genetics. That's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I hope it gets us started. I'm familiar with Colin Wilson. I'm not particularly familiar with that particular book, but yes, I think it would. One of the things that I try and do in my various books is to square attempt to square, I should say, the statements of ancient texts with the findings of modern science. And when you do that, a very interesting picture emerges, because the Vedic texts, of course, if you're familiar with the work of Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson, Forbidden Archaeology, they essentially point out a number of archaeological artifacts and anomalies that strongly suggest that there was at least some intelligent life here for millions of years prior to the rise of modern man. And again, that squares very well with what these ancient texts say, because these ancient texts clearly indicate that there was an intelligent existence and civilization, for that matter, here on Earth prior to the arrival of modern man, which is, 150 to 200,000 years ago. So yeah, I think that's a very plausible scenario that you're suggesting. I take seriously what those cultures say about themselves, particularly Sumer and Egypt, because they define themselves, and especially this is the case in Egypt's case. They define themselves as a legacy of something else, and that raises a very important point, in that if you look at, and I do this with my co-author Scott DeHart in Grid of the Gods, another book that just came out this year, if you look at the various mythologies of these high cultures, the Mayans, the Egyptians, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, even China for that matter, the mythologies are strikingly similar in certain respects. And the only way that, to my mind, you can rationalize this similarity is twofold. Number one, you suppose that there was a pre-existing high civilization that they descended from, which is what they claim. And the second thing that you do is you have to assume that these civilizations, particularly the Egyptian and the Indus Valley and the Sumerian, had some sort of navigational capability. In other words, that they were actually ocean-faring civilizations. So, Thor Heyerdahl, the famous archaeologist back in the 50s and 60s, made that something of a career, where he was documenting that it was entirely possible for these civilizations, using relatively primitive means, to conduct actual ocean-going navigation. So that's the second way you'd account for. That's an interesting topic in itself. I referenced that book by Professor Hapgood in the first of my books, The Giza Death Star. And basically, if you don't know the story, or if your listeners don't know the story, the book is about the map of the Turkish admiral Piri Reis. And this map is intriguing in that, being I think a 16th century map, it details the coastline of Antarctica, which at that point in history had not been, quote-unquote, rediscovered, all right? And the really interesting thing is that the map of the coastline of Antarctica that it details with tremendous accuracy is buried under ice, okay? So in other words, Piri Reis, the Turkish admiral, as he points out, and as Hapgood points out in his book, this map was based on earlier exemplars, all right? Now, the only thing that, to my mind, that he may have been referring to is perhaps maps that were once found in the Library of Alexandria that were managed to get out of there before that library was destroyed or copies made or what have you, and that probably found their way to the imperial archives at Constantinople. And of course, when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, I think it was 1453, my date may be off a couple years, but when they found the imperial archives, of course, they had access to a lot of knowledge that had been hidden away, and that's where I suspect that Piri Reis got his exemplars from, was some ancient lost wisdom that ultimately probably came from Alexandria. Now, the reason I say that is that if you connect the dots, the other thing that some researchers have been finding out and talking about in recent years is that Egypt appears to have had some sort of navigational maritime capability. There's been all sorts of strange Egyptian connections to Central and South America, and even certain places claims are made for an Egyptian influence in North America. I even talk about some of that in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. So yeah, it's fascinating, because what you have here is another clear indicator that the status of scientific knowledge in very ancient times was much higher than academic history, the standard academic model, would allow. So yeah, I think Hapgood's book is must reading if you're into all of this. Quite honestly, I don't recall that. If I recall correctly, what he did and what Hapgood laid out a case for is that he talks additionally in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings about these medieval maps that were called portolans that that appeared to have been based on earlier exemplars. And again, these medieval portolans were not based on any exploration or contact with the New Worlds. And again, I strongly suspect that the source of these maps was precisely the library at Alexandria, because I'm one of those that does not believe that everything from that library was destroyed. I think there were copies of things made from that library that found their ways to other cultural centers in Europe, and that's what I really think is going on here. That's correct, and since we're talking about the Library of Ashurbanipal, the other thing is that, in my opinion, it's probably likely that we have not seen translations of all the tablets that have been found there. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that have not been translated yet. A lot of them are simply, recording business arrangements and contracts and so on and so forth. But I also suspect that there's a bit of academic suppression of some of the more sensational aspects of these tablets. Sitchin mentions one of them in one of his books in the Earth Chronicles series, that Ashurbanipal actually boasts that he is able to read the writings from before the flood. So this is one of those little tidbits that came out of his library, and that, to my mind, suggests that his library may have contained copies of things that were handed down, which brings us back to what we said in the first segment, that a lot of these civilizations are legacies, and as legacies, they are preserving in their mythologies, in their texts, in their lore, and so on and so forth. They're preserving this knowledge from a much higher civilization. And we have to add to this a caveat. They're probably preserving this knowledge without knowing what a lot of it means. They're just handing it down.
In my experience with fraternal esoteric orders, that is the case.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I suspect, and I get into this in the Cosmic War, and again in Genius, Giants, Monsters, and Men, which is kind of a sequel in the Cosmic War series. And forgive me, but let me say something here about the way I write my books. All of my books are kind of laid out in a prearranged sequence, and they all dovetail into each other. They can be read individually as individual books, but once you start reading them, you'll discover that they all kind of plug into each other. And the Cosmic War I intentionally conceived as kind of the keystone in the arch that ties them all together. And one of the things I've mentioned over and over again in that book and in some other books is that on the conclusion of that war, which basically left this high civilization in tatters, you had basically the survival of two elites that tried to hold their scientific knowledge together and, in my opinion, purposely created various mythological forms in order to preserve that knowledge. So I think what you have with the esoteric tradition, where you have the tradition of two brotherhoods, a white brotherhood and a black brotherhood, or a good and an evil brotherhood, depending on your lights, that this actually is the basis for that esoteric tradition. You have really a situation that was very similar to the situation in the world at the end of World War II. You had Europe decimated. You had a group of highly organized, well-financed Nazis, essentially, after the war, that made common cause with the Western elites for a while. So I've kind of used that template of what happened at the end of World War II and read it back into history to see that the same things are really taking place at the end of this cosmic war. The key here with a lot of these Neolithic structures is that my reasoning in reconstructing that part of the history is as follows. If we have surviving elites from a war or some sort of catastrophe, then these elites are going to want to try and jumpstart civilization as quickly as possible again. And in order to have civilization, you have to have commerce. You have to be able to conduct commerce over a wide-ranging area. And in order to do that, in turn, you have to have a reliable system of weights and measures, all right? So I followed kind of the lead of the Oxford engineer Alexander Thome, who dispensed with the idea that ancient systems of measures were based on body parts, which are, of course, variable. And ultimately, I think he probably even rejected the idea that they had some sort of Bureau of Standards somewhere that were sending out, rods of measurement of a certain precise length, because after a certain amount of copying, they're going to lose their accuracy. So what I think happened is you had these brotherhoods, if you will, that came up with a series of measures that would not vary over time and place. And the only way you can do that is to base your system of measures on geodetic measures, in other words, on measures that are tied to the dimensions of the Earth, its mass, its dimensions, and so on, and to astronomical measures. So in other words, you can reduplicate that system of measures if that's your basis of doing so. You can reduplicate that system of measures anywhere on the surface of the Earth. And it's very interesting that once you take that approach and you dig into ancient systems of measures, you find an amazing amount of consistency, again, over time and again over a wide-ranging space. So yeah, I think these Neolithic structures, they show a scientific sophistication that, again, runs counter to the academic view of history that we're taught that, primitive mankind was a hunter-gathering type of society and so on and so forth. That may have been true, but you also had this tremendous building activity displaying tremendous astronomical knowledge at places like Stonehenge, even other places further north in the British Isles, up around the Orkney Islands, that shows tremendous astronomical and geodetic sophistication. So knowledge is being preserved. That's my real point here.
And it's being presented in a unified global system of measurement, is what you're saying.
Yeah, essentially that's correct. I mean, my word, you just have to stop and think about the fact that to this day, our system of measurement of geometry really is basically a Sumerian system. We have a 360-degree circle. That's definitely Sumerian.
The 60, the sexagesimal, right?
The sexagesimal system.
Yes.
And the British imperial system, as I talk about in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I lay out quite a detailed case there for the fact that the British imperial system is based on these geodetic systems of measures and is far older than any British culture even recalls. And in fact, one of the things I point out is that Thomas Jefferson, our third president, did a study of these weights and measures and came to the conclusion himself that these things were handed down from high antiquity. And that was his code for the fact that there was a supremely sophisticated civilization that pre-existed the classical civilizations of Egypt and Sumer and the Indus Valley and so on. This is such a complex subject, and really Babylon's Banksters, which is the book that I think you're referring to, the subtitle of that book is The Alchemy of High Finance and Ancient Religion and so on and so forth. And what I'm trying to do is to show that there is essentially two basic conceptions, both in terms of finance and economics on the one hand, and physics on the other. Because in my opinion, the ancient high civilization had such a grandly unified scientific social vision that it's impossible really to disentangle the two. And the two conceptions of economics and physics that are involved here are what I call closed systems and open systems, all right? In a closed system of physics, you're dealing essentially with the idea of entropy, which we're all familiar with, second law of thermodynamics, that you can never get as much out of any physical system as you put into it. And in an open system of physics, you're dealing with so-called free energy or zero-point energy or so on and so forth. In other words, the idea that you're getting a creation of energy or a transduction of energy directly from the vacuum itself, from the fabric of space-time itself. And the reason that I qualify that as alchemical is that I take a great deal of time in all of my books, Babylon's Banksters, Philosopher's Stone, and most especially in Grid of the Gods, to show that the ancients had a metaphor of the physical medium itself, of the fabric of space-time itself, as being an information-creating medium. And that ties directly into their view of human consciousness, because for them, the physical medium and mind are one and the same thing, All right. And interestingly enough, again, modern physics is coming back close to that point of view. Now, Babylon's Banksters starts out with what I believe is a corruption in that worldview on the part of a few within one of these elites. We would probably today call them bankers. In the book, I call them bullion brokers, because what they do is they usurp the open system of economics, which was based on that physics. And an open system of economics, I mean simply this, that a state has the right, the inherent ability to issue debt-free money. And what the bullion brokers do is they substitute, just as in modern times, a private monopoly of issuance of money, and that money is always tied to the notion of debt. All right? And this is an important lesson. This is what I call closed system finance, because in a closed system of finance, you have a monopoly power over money, a private monopoly power issuing debt as money. So in other words, banks can only loan money into circulation, and what they create is only principal. They never create the interest on the principal. So by virtue of this system, they've set up a closed system in which there's always going to be scarcity. There's always going to be winners. There's always going to be losers. And that is a major departure from the economic system that originally ordered places like Samaria and Egypt, that had this idea that the state itself issued money. And in fact, one of the interesting things, Frater X, is if you go to Sumer, the kind of money that was in circulation was nothing but clay tablets. In other words, it was kind of, their version of paper money. It's at a later point that bullion is associated with money, and it's at that point that you see the emergence of an elite coordinating policy between regions of the world. I talk about the fact that in the Roman Empire, gold was valued as being more valuable than silver, whereas in the Orient it was the other way around. It was silver that was more valuable than gold. And this was done as a policy by both regions of the world to coordinate trade between them. So who's getting rich? It's the bullion brokers managing the trade in bullion between the two. So it's a long story, and I've just begun it in Babylon's Banksters. I'm actually researching sequels to that book right now that I plan to extend that discussion into the future. I hope that answers your question. Well, that's correct. I don't get into that story in Babylon's Banksters because Babylon's Banksters is concerned solely with the very ancient end of that story and, in parts, the very modern end of that story. The book I'm researching right now is going to go into how that story continues from ancient times through the Middle Ages and on up into the beginning of modern times. But yeah, the Templars are definitely involved in this activity. Later on, you see the rise of the Italian city-states at the end of the Middle Ages, with Florence and Genoa and Venice in particular becoming financial centers, with more or less the beginning institutions of modern banking in those cities. But yeah, it's a very important story, because what I'm trying to get people to understand is that there's a direct relationship between the kind of physics that your society is based upon and the kind of economics based upon the kind of physics you evolve.
Can we just for a moment define, give a working definition for those who might not have one readily accessible of what you mean when you say the physics of, for example, an open system physics versus a closed system physics?
Okay, it's very simple. A closed system physics relies for the production of its energy on non-renewable resources, all right? So in other words, and it's also tied into the idea of the second law of thermodynamics, which I mentioned before, that you never get as much energy out of a system as you're putting into it, all right? And open system physics relies upon the idea of energy directly from the fabric of space-time, or the zero-point energy, or so-called free energy. I don't like the expression free energy because it's not really free, and it gives people the wrong impression of the physics involved. But basically, if you're relying on energy directly from the physical medium, that energy supply is inexhaustible. And that's the key. Once you say you have an inexhaustible supply of energy, then you are founding a society, if you found a society based on that kind of energy, you are founding a society which, by the same token, has no need of debt and scarcity.
Right.
So in other words, what I'm trying to get across to people in Babylon's Banksters is that your economic policy and your physics policy are directly related. This is why I spend so much time in Babylon's Banksters talking about the Nazis.
Yeah.
Because Nazi Germany had basically in my opinion, a secret weapons program that was designed and organized precisely around this idea of open physics energy systems. And at the same time, they put into place a financial policy where the state, where the Reich itself, was issuing its currency debt-free. So, basically that shortchanged the bankers. It took them out of the equation. So both systems are kind of dovetailing into each other, and it's therefore not illogical when you find stories of major corporations or financial houses suppressing certain modern inventions that lead or are based upon this idea of an open systems physics, because their power is dependent upon the closed system model. Yeah, I have. I don't know much more about it other than it appears to have been one of the so-called black boats. I don't know that much about this particular instance, but there are a number of these U-boats that have been discovered after the war. But it's worth noting what the black boats were. These were U-boats that the Kriegsmarine had actually falsely numbered. What they would do is if they lost a U-boat, they'd number another U-boat with the same number as the U-boat they lost, and sometimes there was even double numbering of U-boats. Some of these boats were actually turned over directly to the Nazi Party, and that meant that these black boats were under the command of the Nazi Party Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. And it's my supposition, Trader, that these black boats, this black submarine fleet, was actually part of Bormann's strategic evacuation plan that he had come up with more or less after the Battle of Stalingrad, which the Germans, of course, lost. And that these were used in the strategic evacuations of liquid assets, cash, diamonds, platinum, gold, and patents. This is a very important part of the story, that they evacuated actual patents and technical plans and drawings and technicians and personnel from Nazi Germany toward Latin America at the end of the war. My basic thesis, as you know from reading Nazi International, is that Nazism survived the war. But when I say survive, I mean something very different from what most people mean by it. I mean that they survived not only in just little enclaves in Latin America, but that they survived as a large, well-funded, covert intelligence-gathering organization, kind of more or less like an extraterritorial state, and that they continued many of their secret research projects independently of the Soviets or the Allied powers after World War II, and did so in Latin America.
Okay, well, a couple of things that you mentioned in Nazi International that I found quite remarkable. One of them was the fact that the Nazis never actually signed the two treaties with the Allies.
Well, actually, it's even more ridiculous than that. To this day, you cannot find any real treaty of peace between the Allies and Germany. There is no formal cessation of hostilities. But what I point out in Nazi International is that the surrender documents, there are two surrenders that the Nazis signed at the end of World War II. The first is a surrender that was held on May 7th in Reims, France. The representative for Germany that signed this instrument was Colonel General Alfred Jodl, who was the chief of staff for the German Reich. He signed that one. Then the next day, another ceremony was held in Berlin at the insistence of the Russians, who wanted a higher-ranking representative to sign for them, and that was, of course, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. And the German representatives were Admiral von Friedeberg, representing the German Navy, Colonel General Stumpf, I believe it was, for the Luftwaffe, and then Field Marshal Keitel for the German army. Now, this is interesting because the representatives signing the treaty, the actual surrender documents, the representatives are representatives of the German armed forces. There is no legal representative present at either signing that is signing on behalf of the Reich government itself, which at that time was headed by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as the Führer of Nazi Germany. There's no one signing in behalf of the Reich government, and in my opinion, much more importantly, is that the Allies were in a position to have a representative of the Nazi Party present at least the Berlin signing, and yet they did not do so, which I find very curious. But this means, in effect, that the Nazi Party itself never actually signed any instrument of surrender. And that kind of plays into my story about post-war Nazi survival, because what I'm arguing in Nazi International is essentially that this party went underground. It had its own intelligence services. It was conducting its own research. It was oftentimes in league with the American CIA in various post-war covert operations as the soldiers on the ground. So it was, in other words, it was a very, very powerful post-war organization. It had deep ties, interestingly enough, to radical Islam, and was, even after the war, involved in direct contact with radical Islam, and I detail that in the Nazi International as well. U-234 was a U-boat that departed Germany in the last weeks of the war, and I spent a great deal of time in the Nazi International talking about this particular U-boat because it eventually surrendered to the United States after deliberately avoiding surrendering to the Canadians. And it's interesting, Frater, that during this sea voyage, as it's trying to avoid the Canadians to surrender to the United States, that the United States actually jammed Canada's radio transmissions so that they could not find this U-boat. All right? So in other words, a lot of attention is being paid to this particular boat on the part of the American military. The reason why is that this U-boat carried 80 gold-lined canisters. 2 Japanese officers who had labeled the canisters in Germany as they were being loaded into this U-boat had labeled the canisters U-235, in other words, uranium-235. Now, the gold canisters are significant because when you are transporting highly enriched uranium, you do not put that uranium in lead, because lead is very corrosive with uranium, and it would corrupt the enrichment of that particular uranium sample. So if you're going to transport uranium-235 yellowcake, essentially that's what it would have been, you would do so in gold-lined cylinders. This is a profound and important clue, because this means that you had 80 canisters of these things. There was, I don't remember right off the top of my head the figure, but it was enough uranium to have made a fissionable atomic bomb. So in other words, this is a signal clue that the Nazi atom bomb project was not nearly as incompetent as the Allied post-war legends made it out to be. The Germans are enriching uranium on a massive scale, and they're doing so, in my opinion, very successfully. Well, yeah, actually I discuss all of this in a book of mine called Reich of the Black Sun, which is the first book in the Nazi series of books that I've written, because in my opinion there's very strong coincidental and circumstantial evidence that the Nazi atom bomb project may have been actually successful. In other words, that they may have acquired an atomic bomb. In that book, I point out a memorandum from the chief metallurgist at Los Alamos in New Mexico. Yeah, I was mentioning before the break that the chief metallurgist at Los Alamos, a fellow by the name of Eric Jett, had written a memo in December of 1944 stating that the United States would not have enough fissile uranium to make an atomic bomb until approximately November of 1945. And the reason for that is that the United States had taken some of its uranium stock and put it into the reactors at Hanford to make plutonium for the plutonium bomb. Now, after the U-234 surrenders, curiously enough, records from Oak Ridge state that our supply of uranium stocks doubled. So in other words, I think it's fairly clear that at least some of the uranium in the little boy bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was probably from Nazi Germany. Now, I go into a lengthy scenario, as you know, Frater X, in the Nazi International of how I think U-234 played into Bormann's plans of getting himself and other key Nazis out of Germany. It's my opinion that Bormann probably put himself and other key Nazis on that U-boat knowing full well that the Americans, that he had brokered a deal with the Americans to turn over this uranium, and knowing full well that with the Americans making sure that U-boat would not be sunk by anybody, got himself out on it without telling anybody that's how he was going to do it. Now, that puts me at odds with other people that have different scenarios with Bormann's escape and some of the other scenarios of the escape of high-ranking Nazis, but that, in my opinion, is probably how he did it. So, yeah, the story of the Nazi A-bomb is a huge story. It's one that has not been told properly, in my opinion, and that's just scratching the iceberg of what they were really up to. Sure. The Foundation for the Study of Cycles was actually started by an American economist that used to work for the Department of Commerce under President Hoover, a fellow by the name of Edward Dewey. And this is a very, very little-known story about the Great Depression and President Hoover, because Hoover wanted to know why we kept getting into cycles of boom and bust. And he wasn't satisfied with the answers he was getting from other economists. So he tasked Edward Dewey at the Commerce Department with the goal of finding out why this kept happening. What Dewey then did is he turned to the massive database in the Department of Commerce. And instead of trying to figure out why cycles happened, he was trying to figure out what they were first. So he compiled a massive database of cycles of activity in every conceivable arena that you can think of. Sunspot activity, corn harvests, silkworm population growths, and so on and so forth. And he began to correlate all of these cycles, and he discovered that there were certain patterns in them. There were 54-year cycles, 9-year cycles, 18-year cycles, and so on and so forth. And he and a Canadian biologist, Copley, managed to pool their research interests together, and lo and behold, they discovered cycles in biology. They discovered cycles of human population growths, every conceivable activity that you can think of. Well, Dewey then went on in the 1950s to found the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. And this foundation still exists. It's located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it has a massive database, Frater, of cycles of every sort. And at a certain point in its history, the membership of this foundation decided that they were going to try and correlate cycles that were seemingly unrelated to each other. And Dewey actually published a book called The Study of Cycles. And I reference this book very, very heavily in Babylon's Banksters, because here's the hidden part of the story. What Dewey concluded was that no action by any government could alter these cycles, because he almost comes right out and says these cycles are inherently tied to physics. All that governments can do is exacerbate or alleviate the overall trend of a cycle, but they cannot alter the direction of the cycle itself. So in other words, if you are in possession of the knowledge of these huge business cycles in history, then if you are a major corporation or major bank, you can plan activity accordingly, either to ameliorate the effect of these cycles or to worsen or deepen them, depending on the actions you take. Now, that may seem like a leap in the dark, but in actual fact, when you look at the membership list of the Foundation of Cycles, you'll discover economists from major banks are on the membership lists of this particular foundation. So in other words, you're dealing with some off-the-books knowledge. It's knowledge right out in plain sight, but if you don't know of the existence of this thing, you won't know to look for it, and that's a key part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, when you talk about Hoover wanting an explanation for all that he recognized in these boom and bust, well, there was like 7 Great Depressions?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Most people don't even realize that.
Now, the reason, let me interrupt. I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, that's fine. Go ahead.
This is very crucial, because the reason I stress that there is a physics behind this is that if you go to, and this is going to sound completely out of left field, but if you go to astrology and look at the natal chart, so to speak, of the United States of America, and then plot the planetary alignments during the American Great Depressions, the Great Depression of 1789, there's another one in the 1830s, another one in the 1890s, and then, of course, the real Great Depression in 1929 up through 31, 32. If you look at these Great Depressions, each one of them is accompanied by a planetary configuration that astrologers call the Grand Cross. Now, that may sound like so much hokum, except that in the 1950s, as I also point out in Babylon's Banksters, the RCA Corporation tasked one of its chief engineers, a fellow by the name of Nelson, to figure out why sunspot activity seemed to dampen shortwave radio transmissions. Well, Nelson came back with a study that just blew everybody's minds, because he concluded that sunspot cycles were correlated to the positions of various planets. And the type of planetary configurations that he mapped for the RCA Corporation strongly resemble the astrological phenomenon, or the astrological alignment called the Grand Cross, which accompanies Great Depressions. Now, I mention all of this again because the Foundation for the Study of Cycles implied very strongly that there is a direct correlation between economic activity and the cycles thereof and actual physical phenomena. So, in other words, there is, in my opinion, Frater, a deep physics that is closely tied, just as I said in an earlier segment, to the kind of financial or economic policy that you have in place in a particular civilization. So, yeah, you've got a group out there that has done nothing but amass a huge database of cycles of all sorts, and they're trying to figure out correlations between individual types of cycles from one discipline to another. And that I think should give everybody pause, because banks have access to this. They have members in this foundation. And you referenced Isaac Asimov and his Foundation novels. Well, in the Foundation novels, Asimov talks about psychohistory, which is a mathematical model of predicting aggregate human behavior. And again, again, as I point out in Babylon's Banksters, there is a whole phenomenon most people aren't even aware of, and that is physicists graduating with their degrees in quantum mechanics, which is a highly statistical field with a lot of statistical mathematics, going to work for financial institutions in the 50s and 60s and creating the whole discipline called econophysics by taking mathematical models from physics and applying it to economics. So, yeah, all of this is tied together.
So, obviously, Asimov was a student of finance, and it turns out they're just using an intricate form of astrology.
Yeah. Again, let's talk about the astrology thing for just a brief moment. Because astrology, as most people are aware of, most people are familiar with the fact that it arises in Mesopotamia with the civilizations of Sumer, and then later, of course, Babylon and Assyria and so on, and for that matter, Egypt as well. Now, if we go back to what I said in the first hour, what you're dealing with in these civilizations are legacies of a very high civilization that had an extremely sophisticated scientific knowledge. And it's my belief, based on some of the research that I've reproduced in Babylon's Banksters, that astrology itself is one of these declined scientific legacies. It's declined to the point of being a pseudoscience, but at one time, in my opinion, there was probably a real science behind it that institutions like the Foundation of the Study of Cycles are getting back to and just beginning to rediscover. No, it doesn't exclude it at all. In fact, in the book that my co-author Scott DeHart and I wrote, Grid of the Gods, I talk about the Mayan Popol Vuh and what it says about humanity. And in fact, he and I just completed a book and sent it off to a publisher that'll be out sometime next year, in which we go into that whole question even in more depth. But no, it doesn't exclude that idea at all. If you go back to the Mesopotamian texts that suggest that there was some sort of genetic engineering of mankind that took place in very, very ancient times, in order for that to happen, you have to have some sort of genetic compatibility between whoever did that to us and us to begin with. So no, there's certainly no objection to the idea that there's a pre-existing sort of genome. Well, number one, spread it. I think that's the key right there. And number two, this is a very important point, and that is recognize the patterns that elites have used throughout history. And once you recognize the patterns, then you are less susceptible to the kind of social engineering that they're up to now. Because, and this is really kind of the other point of Babylon's Banksters, because the playbook really hasn't changed in its basic conceptualizations all that much throughout the millennia. It's still basically the same playbook. Once you understand the strategies and tactics and the patterns thereof that are involved, then you're better able to see when they're being practiced now, and therefore to resist its influence and effect on your own personal life. Yeah, what I tried to do in that book is sift through the major research of Kennedy assassination researchers and really to kind of reverse engineer the structure of the conspiracy. And what I discovered was that you can take the members of the Warren Commission themselves and use them as a kind of template to uncover the structure, because each of the men involved on the Warren Commission had direct ties to the interests that other JFK assassination researchers have pointed out as possibly being involved in the conspiracy. The mafia, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, high finance, intelligence, all of this stuff. The one thing I do in LBJ that very few other researchers into the Kennedy assassination have done is I do point out that there is a strong connection between the Texas oil men and this post-war Nazi international structure. And this is an aspect that no one in Kennedy research that I'm aware of, other than myself, has really gone into. It was known to Jim Garrison, but he didn't really know what to do about it. And in the director's cut of Oliver Stone's JFK film, there are scenes in that film that aren't really explained in the director's cut that got deleted from the theatrical version. And again, it's because really I don't think that Stone, basing his work on Garrison to some extent, that Stone even knew how to deal with it. And I try and trace out those connections in the book as well. But, the big toad squatting in the middle of this conspiracy is, of course, Lyndon Johnson. And I do think that he was involved, at least as an accessory after the fact, in covering up some of this stuff. And I do make a case that he may have been more actively involved at a planning level in the conspiracy as well. So yeah, that book is quite an interesting read. I actually talk about that book in LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy. I'm friends with Mr. Hoagland and used some of their research in Dark Mission in LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy. Approximately 250,000 years ago. So that seems to square rather interestingly with the results of genetic research that place the origins of modern man circa 150 to 200,000 years ago. So I don't really fasten any broad chronological scheme on things other than those two dates, 3.2 million years ago for this cosmic war, and then the various kings lists from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and try and couple those with modern genetics. That's a roundabout way of answering your question, but I hope it gets us started. I'm familiar with Colin Wilson. I'm not particularly familiar with that particular book, but yes, I think it would. One of the things that I try and do in my various books is to attempt to square, I should say, the statements of ancient texts with the findings of modern science. And when you do that, a very interesting picture emerges, because the Vedic texts, of course, if you're familiar with the work of Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson, Forbidden Archaeology, they essentially point out a number of archaeological artifacts and anomalies that strongly suggest that there was at least some intelligent life here for millions of years prior to the rise of modern man. And again, that squares very well with what these ancient texts say, because these ancient texts clearly indicate that there was an intelligent existence and civilization, for that matter, here on Earth prior to the arrival of modern man, which is, 150 to 200,000 years ago. So yeah, I think that's a very plausible scenario that you're suggesting. I take seriously what those cultures say about themselves, particularly Sumer and Egypt, because they define themselves. Well, my biggest problem when I started doing this research, and even back when I was still associated with college teaching, was that the Western academies and American universities in particular seem unable to look at the problems with the assumptions that they make concerning human prehistory. And the problem is briefly and basically this, that if you look at the rise of civilizations such as the Indus Valley civilization, the rise of Sumer in Mesopotamia, the rise of Egypt for that matter, what you're looking at are really civilizations that come fully formed when they arrive on the scene. In other words, there's no gradual period leading up to them. They're just all of a sudden there. And they're there with a great deal of mathematical sophistication. There was a cosmic war. It was fought right here in our own solar system. And if you look at the scientific and astronomical data that are associated with it, that would fix a date of approximately 3.2 million years ago. So, standard academic history says that there was really nothing going on back then as far as humanity is concerned. And in fact, as I point out in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, the genetic basis of the origins of humanity, most geneticists believe, begins between 150 and 200,000 years ago, which to me is a very, very significant figure, Frater X, because if you look at some of the ancient texts that I examine in the Cosmic War and in other books in that whole arch of books, they will tell you, for example, in the Sumerian kings list, that the so-called Anunnaki, the gods, if you will, arrived here in astronomical sophistication. They have organized economies. So in other words, the evolutionary model that was imposed on human prehistory just really didn't work, and you get sort of a sidestepping of this profound issue. So when you're looking at a time frame, and one thing I should point out is that in my books I do not really go the Sitchin-esque route of trying to construct a detailed timetable, and the reason why is that I think you have to reconstruct this history in broad outline first. In other words, get a basic chronological order of things that happen, but not necessarily trying to fix any particular date to them. Now, I do fix a date in the Cosmic War for what I think happened millennia ago, and that is basically that